we bear in mind that the witness does produce a number of reports, and you should have time to cross-examine on them. The prosecution were a little under an hour and 40 minutes. We'll allow you 2.5 hours, which means you've got 2 hours remaining.
I think that will be sufficient. I shall do my best to hurry things up. In your statement on page 11, last paragraph, you say that after returning to New York, that you received reports that 8 Croatian prisoners were executed in Bač, Vojvodina, the Republic of Serbia. From whom and when did you receive reports to that effect?
I don't think I can answer that question. The reports came to members of my staff. They were, as I said in my testimony, we had no opportunity to investigate them ourselves, which is why we sent this letter to you asking for information.
Yes, but then you go on to say that you cannot bear out the assertions with regard to the alleged killing of 8 soldiers. You say the following: I cannot confirm the execution as having occurred.
This should be revealed with further research and evidence since the alleged incidents.
Can we consider on that basis that this assertion, this claim made, cannot be understood as part of a testimony which you are able to confirm?
That was a request for information, not an assertion of fact.
And did you ever later on establish that a case of that kind never took place, that somebody was brought into the territory of Serbia and then killed there by the army or anybody else for that matter?
I don't know that we ever were able to get to the bottom of that particular assertion, but we, of course, documented many other cases of killings by all sides.
All right. As to other cases are a different matter, and we can also challenge that. But what I'm asking you about is this particular one. So I assume that it is clear that you cannot confirm this one. Isn't that right?
I can confirm that we never received a response one way or another to our request for information.
All right, let's move on. In the report of September 1991, your colleagues state that the Serbs in Croatia were opposed to the provision of the Croatian Constitution of 1990, which reads as follows, and then you go on to quote. In your report it says the Republic of Croatia is comprised as a national state of the Croatian people
and all minorities who are citizens of Croatia itd. Onda se oni
and all minorities who are citizens of Croatia, and then you go on to list them. And then you further state the following. Instead of that, the Serbs, as is stated in that same paragraph of the report, came out in favor of the following formulation. And then you say the Serb formulation, the Republic of Croatia, is comprised as a national state of the Croatian and Serbian peoples and all other nationalities. And so on and so forth. That's what it says in the report. That is not disputed, isn't that right, Ms. Leber?
You're right. We were just trying to express the point of view of the people of the region.
Very well, and is it correct that the second provision that you say that the Serbs are asking for is not an expression of any pure desires on the part of the Serbs, but that it represented a provision of the then enforced Constitution of Croatia and all the previous constitutions of the Republic of Croatia ever since Croatia came into existence as a republic? That is to say that the Serbs in all those constitutions were treated and enjoyed rights as a constituent peoples and not as a national minority. Is that something you're aware of or not?
I have not studied all of the constitutions. I will take your word for that fact. I have no reason to dispute it.
But since we're dealing with a question of substance here, because the Serbs with the new constitution were thrown out of the constitution as a peoples, as a nation, is it possible that your colleagues intentionally in their report kept silent over this fact because they were professionals dealing in the constitution? If they are experts in the field, then they must have read the constitution, right?
I assume they did. I don't think they were intentionally silent of the fact they did report the grievances of the Serbs with this provision. We took it seriously.
All right, and is it possible that your colleagues intentionally did so, on purpose?
Intentionally.
Although it is of fundamental importance that the new Croatian constitution degraded the status of the Serbs, is it possible that they didn't know about that fact and therefore did not report it, did not state it?
My impression is that report attempts and successfully succeeds in presenting both the point of view of the Serb minority and the point of view of the Croatians in Croatia. We were not taking a position on it either way. We were trying to reflect how each side saw their situation.
Precisely in that context that you have just referred to, can we consider that leaving out such a substantive fact, that is the status of the Serb people in Croatia according to all constitutions in force up till then, that status was abolished, and as a result a distorted picture is given of the events? Can that be in conformity with the higher standards that you have referred to, higher standards of work in your organization?
I think that this description at the very beginning of the report was an attempt to set the background. It really was not the purpose of the report. The report was to document particular facts that we found on the ground. There's a lot that wasn't said in the background section, including what you say about the constitutions. I see no reason why we would have left it out, except perhaps for reasons of space. It is an important fact if what you report is correct, and I don't think it changes in any way the sympathetic portrayal that we give of the Serb position as well as of the Croat position at that time and place.
Very well, but then, in view of the fundamental importance of what I have just mentioned, your organization and you personally did not really know what it was all about.
Mr. Milosevic, what seems important to you may not have seemed as important to our researchers. You can go way back in history. We could have, one has to draw a line at some point. We were just trying to sketch out the background. If that fact was not there, I don't think it was done by intent, nor do I think it was professional incompetence in any way.
But that's not going back into history. That's the situation that was in force until that day in Croatia when the changes occurred that you referred to. That was that particular moment in time when the situation was changed and the status of the Serbs deteriorated. Let us move on. In the report from September 1991, in pages between 19 and 22, there is reference to shooting at ambulances and holding medical staff as hostages. End of quotation. A description is given of events in July 91, which allegedly occurred in a village close to the Hrvatska Kostajnica in the region of Banija. According to this report, this village should have been between Kostajnica and Dvor na Uni. Will you please tell us the name of that village and what incident occurred there, if you know?
I am not the author of this report. It was compiled by my highly professional and impartial staff. My job was to take their findings and to bring it to the attention of responsible officials like yourself. I can say that I take full responsibility for the work of my staff and the people who worked under me, as I believe all leaders, including yourself, should take responsibility for the people who work for you.
Yes, but please, Mr. Leiber, will you answer my question? How am I able to put a question to you in connection with the facts alleged, not facts, but allegations which your colleagues, Ron and Nizic, got from anonymous victims and witnesses if they don't even know where the event they're describing took place?
Perhaps it's a little bit late for you to be responding to a report that was brought to your attention in 1991. At the time, this could have been a relevant discussion. At this point, I'm here not to discuss or defend the details of these reports, so to bring to your attention the fact that I tried to bring this to your attention as the director of my organization at the time that this was happening, and that we did not get an adequate response.
You are saying that this happened in Croatia, and as you know, I was the president of Serbia. So what was happening wasn't happening on the territory of Serbia, so therefore how could I respond to something that was happening in Croatia?
Our impression at the time, and all the evidence that we collected, and it was not just our organization, but I think many impartial observers of the scene, was that the events in Croatia were not just supported, but actually encouraged by your government in Serbia. That the tactics that were used there, we were subsequently would see repeated in Bosnia, stirring up ethnic unrest on the part of the Serbs, taking some even legitimate concerns about their own safety and building it into a state of hysteria, encouraging them to take up arms so that there would then be reason for the Yugoslav army, which by all intents and purposes was under your control, or at least your influence, could move in to protect those Serbs and actually allow the abuses that take place to continue and participated in them in certain cases.
Those can only be assumptions on your part. As we're trying to establish the facts, and you have here mentioned an area, do you know the distance between Kostajnica and Dvor na Uni, and how many villages there are in between?
I do not claim to be an expert on the geography of Croatia. I was, however, in Dvor na Uni at one point.
Very well, but in describing this event on page 21 of the report, on paragraph 5, it says that medical staff and the wounded were called upon to surrender and were arrested by 10 men, and then in yellow camouflage uniforms with no patch or insignia, 10 men in yellow camouflage uniforms. Can you tell us which formation these men belong to? On what basis do your colleagues claim that those men were Serbs?
I cannot tell you. Obviously, they did not know themselves which formation they belonged to. They say that they were wearing yellow camouflage uniforms with no patch or insignia.
Very well. Do you allow for the possibility that they could have been Croats? On what grounds are you claiming that they were Serbs?
My impression, reading the report, the same report that you're reading, is that the testimonies of the victims said that they were Serbs.
Do you know that within the territory of the former SFRY, not a single grouping wore yellow camouflage uniforms? I hear for the first time in your testimony now that there were people wearing yellow camouflage uniforms.
This was the evidence we received.
Doesn't it seem to you that this fact is, to say the least, rather strange, because I assume you know that yellow camouflage uniforms are used in desert land. Nobody in Europe ever wore them.
I've said all I can say on that subject, I'm afraid.
Very well, Ms. Leber, please tell me, how can we know who those people were? If the story has any grounds at all, who are those people wearing yellow uniforms that do not exist in the area, without insignia, and capturing ambulances in a village whose name is unknown?
Mr. Milosevic, the witness has said that she can give no further evidence on the topic. You can comment in due course, but there's not much point going on asking her about it.
Very well. My question, Mr. May, is whether such a large amount of imprecision and lack of clarity and arbitrariness can be comparable to the highest standards of work in your organization. Because you can't answer and tell me which village is involved and whether they were really wearing yellow uniforms, and we don't know how can one know who the people without insignia are, and can an answer to these questions be given by your colleagues who compiled the report, or perhaps the people you spoke to? You're unable to answer any one of those questions. Isn't that so?
That's not quite true. I could certainly get the answer to these questions from the people who compiled the report. As I've made clear to you before, I was not part of this fact-finding missions that went into the compilation of this report. I have great faith in the competence of the people who prepared it. I would assume that they would have the answers for you, and I can even try to get that for you if it's appropriate. If the court considers it appropriate, I can do some research on this. I did not come here to defend the specific information within the report paragraph by paragraph. My job was to take this report and try to get your response to it back in 1991 at the time that it was written.
onda je pitanje da li uopšte ima smisla da
Well,
vas
then
ispitujemo
one
o
wonders
navodnim
whether there's
događajima
any
o
point
kojima
in me
imate samo
examining you about
tako
alleged events on which you have
posredna navodna saznanja,
only
pa čak i takve
indirect
činjenice kao što su
knowledge,
mesto događaja,
even
akteri, ne može
such
da
facts
razjasni.
as the location of the events, the participants in the events.
da
These are things you're unable
bi
to
morali da
clarify.
se
So I
usredsredimo na
think
ono
we should
što ste vi lično utvrdili
focus
prilikom
on
boravka
what
u
you
Jugoslaviji.
personally established during your visits to Yugoslavia.
A ne ono što su utvrđivali
And
vaši
not what
saradnici
was
koji, kao što vidite,
found by your
utvrđuju neke stvari
associates
koje su
who, as
prilično
you
nelogične.
see, are alleging certain things that are rather illogical.
Well, I do not say that. I do not acknowledge that they're illogical. As I say, I'm happy to get the answers to any of the questions you might have about specific information in this report. These reports were compiled 10 years ago. We have files in our office. We have researchers who can answer your questions. I can't do it offhand at this moment in time. It was not the reason why I came here today. I was here to speak as the director of the organization on the issue of whether your government was notified about our reports.
Pa o tome i jeste stvar da
That is
se
the
ova
point.
strana setila
That
posle
this
12
other
godina
side
da
remembered
pokrene-
12 years
da pokrene
later
ovu tužbu. A da li vam se
to
čini
start these proceedings. Don't you think?
I've stopped you, Mr. Milosevic. You're getting a long way from the point. You're attacking the prosecution. Now, you can ask the witness further questions if you want, but rather that than comments on the prosecution.
Svedokinja se, gospodine May, bavi
The
ljudskim
witness,
pravima, pa
Mr. May,
pretpostavljam da je
specializes in
poznato
human
da
rights,
bi
so
onda
I
druga
assume
strana, da bi
she
ovakve tvrdnje
knows that
iznosila,
for the other
morala da
side to
dovede
make
te
such
ljude
allegations, it should bring
koji su
those
očevici tih
people who were
događaja, da bi
eyewitnesses
oni
of
mogli
these
da budu
events,
ispitani.
for them to be able to
Tih
be
navodnih
examined
događaja.
here regarding those events.
That's up to them, and it's also up to us what evidence we require. It's not up to the witness.
Dobro, na trećoj strani
Very
iskaza u
well. On
prvom
page
pasusu
3 of
navodite
your
da ste u
testimony,
avgustu
in
90.
paragraph 1, you say that in August
otputovali sa
1990,
osobom koja se
you
zove
left
Anderson u
with a
ime
person
Human
called
Rights Watcha
Anderson
u
on behalf of
istraživačku
Human
misiju u
Rights
Hrvatsku,
Watch on an
Kosovo i
investigative
onda u
mission to
Beograd.
Croatia, Kosovo, and
Da li
Belgrade.
je to vaša jedina istraživačka
Was that
misija
your
vezana
only
za
fact-finding
rat u Krajini i
mission
Hrvatskoj?
linked to the war in Krajina and Croatia?
Me personally, do you mean?
Da, vaša.
Yes, yes, you personally.
Yes, my only fact-finding mission was this trip with Mr. Anderson. After that, as the situation escalated, we had many people going, as I said before, more or less constant presence there during 1991 and 1992. I also conducted a fact-finding mission in January of 1992, but that concerned the issue of rape as a war crime. And in that case, we, as I mentioned before, we interviewed victims that were both Serbs, Croats, and Muslims.
Dobro, da li to znači da jedino onaj
Does that
dolazak iz
mean
avgusta meseca
that
90. bio
only the
istraživačka
visit
misija
of
vezana
August
za rat u Krajini
1990 was an exploratory
Hrvatskoj,
mission linked to the war in
u kojoj
Krajina
ste vi
and
neposredno
Croatia that you
učestvovali,
took
mislim na istraživačku misiju?
an active part in person? I'm talking of this exploratory mission.
Yes. What we saw in that mission was the beginnings of what had developed into an explosive and very serious situation. And at that point, I was back in New York, sending people from New York in various combinations to investigate what was going on. I believe we sent
Dobro,
six individual missions in the course of that year, and we also maintained a constant presence on the ground.
dakle, pošto ste bili na Kosovu
Since you were in
90.
Kosovo in
godine, da li vam je
1990,
poznato da
do you know that the presence of security forces in Kosovo at the time you were there was based on a decision of the federal government and the federal presidency because of the very extreme jeopardy that the Serb population was in, who were leaving en masse under pressure of Albanian extremists? Did you learn anything about that?
What I saw at that time was a very heavy employment of federal troops in Kosovo. There were soldiers everywhere and roadblocks everywhere and active military maneuvers against small towns in the region. I did not see any evidence of active armed insurrection on the part of the Albanians in Kosovo at that time. It seemed like an overreaction to whatever was driving the Serb minority from Kosovo.
Very well. That is what the impression you had, as you yourself say. But during your mission in August 1991, which state did you go to?
Which state did I go to?
Yes, which state did you go to in August 1991?
I didn't take a mission in August 1991. I don't know what mission you're talking about. You're talking about me personally now or the organization?
You say that you were there in 1991, don't you?
No, I was there in 1990.
Very well. In 1990, which country did you go to? Which state?
In 1990, I was in Croatia and in Serbia.
Do you know that in 1990, when you were there, that the only international legal entity in that area, the only recognized entity was Yugoslavia, which was the only one that could have been considered a state?
Of course I know that. I thought you wanted to know the specific republics that I visited. I know that, of course, I was in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. That's what it was called at that time.
Very well. Could the same be said in September 91, when your colleagues Nižić and Rom went on a mission? That's right, isn't it?
By September 91, I believe Croatia and Slovenia had declared their secession from the Federal Republic. Is that correct?
Something else. But you know that the United Nations recognized Croatia not before mid-1992. I assume you're aware of that.
Yes, I am aware of that.
And linked to the discussion here, the relevant time is when the United Nations recognized Croatia. And do you know that on the 7th of July 1991, Yugoslavia was still in existence, and with the presence of the European community, representatives of the European community, there was a meeting on Brioni of members of the presidency of the SFRY, the federal prime minister, the federal ministers of the interior, defense, the leadership of Slovenia and Croatia, and that a joint declaration was adopted on a peaceful settlement to the Yugoslav crisis. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. I don't see where it's relevant to my testimony. Our organization has never taken any position on the integrity of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, nor have I personally. That was not our concern. It's not within our mandate.
A dobro, da li vam je poznato, jer vi se bavite
Yes,
pravima?
but are you aware of it? Because you specialize in rights, that those decisions on the proclamation of sovereignty and independence in 1991 were anti-constitutional and contrary to international law, in violation of international law.
I think that's beyond my competence to discuss that question.
Pa dobro, ali konstatovali smo da ste
But
vi sami 90.
we
i vaše
have
kolege 91.
agreed that you yourself in 1990 and your colleagues in 1991 were legally in the territory of a country that was legal and internationally recognized, that is the SFRY.
That's correct.
Na kraju oba izveštaja koje ste
At the end of
predali
both
stoji
reports
konstatacija
is the statement that the Helsinki Watch, which is now a branch of the Human Rights Watch, was founded in 1979 in order to supervise respect on the internal and international plane of human rights provisions from the Declaration of 1975. This is on page 13, the second paragraph, and in the second report on page 8, second paragraph. That's right, isn't it? That is not in dispute. Does that mean that you, as one of the founders and the executive director of Helsinki Watch, are familiar with the contents of the mentioned acts from the Helsinki Conference of 1975, as well as other acts on human rights?
Yes, I am.
Do you know then Principle 8, Paragraph 1 of the final document from Helsinki, the Helsinki Declaration of 1975, which reads,
"The participating states will respect the equal rights of peoples and their right to self-determination, acting at all times in conformity with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN and with the relevant norms of international law, including those relating to the territorial integrity of states." Dakle, u tom aktu
So in that document, which you say you are familiar with, that is what is stated in that document. That's right, isn't it, Ms. Leber?
That is stated in the document. I'm familiar with the document, but this is not the part of the document that we involve ourselves with as a human rights organization. We take no position in any country on questions of sovereignty or secession or national borders. This is beyond our competence and it's beyond our mandate.
But a moment ago, we established that you were founded to monitor compliance with the human rights provisions of the 1975 Helsinki Accords. So you didn't select which rights you would engage in and which you would not. Do you know that Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter protects the territorial integrity of states, and the right to self-determination of rights mentioned in the Charter should be seen in such a way as not to violate the territorial integrity of states. Is that so or not, Ms. Leber?
I think I'm repeating myself now. That is, we were and are committed to protect the human rights provisions within the Helsinki Accords. We did not take national self-determination or national integrity as one of those rights that we dealt with. We dealt with rights to free expression, rights to be free of torture, rights to speak one's mind, rights not to be imprisoned for one's political views, all of the basic civil and political rights that are guaranteed not just by inference in the Helsinki Accords, but also in the United Nations Declaration, Human Rights Declaration.
Human rights, Ms. Leber, are a comprehensive concept one right cannot be drawn out of context of the body of human rights. Are you familiar with the provision of the Declaration regarding the principles of international law regarding friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the UN Charter, specifically the part regarding the right to self-determination, which is considered a component part? This is the Declaration of Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the UN. Resolution 265 of the General Assembly, dated the 24th of October, 1970.
Mr. Milosevic, I'm sure you're aware there are many ongoing discussions about human rights and categories of rights, classes of rights. Different organizations like our own have the right ourselves to choose which rights we would protect and defend. We cannot cover the entire gamut. We had our own mandate, which is very clearly spelled out in internal documents, which are not secret in any way, as to which rights we will protect and investigate and defend. And at the risk of repeating myself, the right to self-determination or national protection of national borders was not one of them. It's not to say that we're not in favor or unfavored. It was not part of our mandate to get involved with those issues, which are very complicated ones and would have taken us into the sphere of politics, which we try to avoid.
Very well, but since you're professionally involved and consider yourself to be a human rights advocate, I assume you must know the provisions of this declaration and other documents regarding the right to self-determination.
I think we've exhausted this topic. The witnesses answered, Mr. Milosevic. We're not getting any benefit from constant repetition.
All right, now do you know that according to the United Nations Charter and the declaration mentioned and other international acts, the external self-determination or rather secession is allowed only to colonies, occupied states, etc. and the like?
I really don't want to go, I don't feel that it is my purpose in coming here was not to discuss these issues. I don't feel they're relevant.
If you can, well, that's for us to say. But if you don't think you can add anything to what you've said. No, Mr. Milosevic, nobody's being helped by this. Now move on to some other topic the witness can deal with.
Well, it seems rather strange, Mr. May, that when we're talking with a prominent representative of a human rights organization, that you exclude these, how shall I call them, substantive issues related to human rights.
You can address us about it, no doubt you will.
And do you know of an observation made by Antonio Cassese, the former president of this particular institution? And it was published in a book called Self-Determination of People, Reappraisal, written by him. It was published by the University of...
I don't think this is going to help either. We've dealt with self-determination insofar as we can. Now, you can ask some other witness about it, you could present evidence about it, but this witness has told you she can't help you any further. So there's no point going on.
This witness dealt with Yugoslavia, Mr. May, and this has to do with Yugoslavia. This concerns Yugoslavia, and you should...
I'm not going to permit any more questions on a topic on which the witness cannot give you any further answers. It is a pointless exercise to go on. Now just move on to something else which she can deal with.
Well, for me to be able to move on and ask her something with respect to the report in which the witness observes in page 6, footnote 13, in her report of January 1991.
Moment, let us find it. January 1991, tab 1. Let's find the reference, page 6. Right, we've got page 6. Footnote 13, we have it, yes?
In which it is stated that in the defense of independence, Tudjman says, in the defense of independence, we would first use all our regular forces of the Croatian Interior Ministry, and we would also invite our entire people to take arms. And this is the statement that is included into your report. Now, in light of these allegations and in what it says in your report, how can you comment on the fact that it is precisely Mr. Cassese who says the following under international law?
Oh, I've ruled out what Mr. Cassese says. Now, it sounds like a legal argument which you can address to us. We'll hear all about it, but it's not for the witness. Now move on, or I'm bringing this cross-examination to a close. It's a matter for you, Mr. Milosevic, whether you want to ask further questions or not. You've heard the ruling.
Microphone, please. Microphone, please.
Now, are you now moving on to another question?
Well, do you know that with the legal norms that were in force, these were illegal acts of violent secession on the part of Croatia seceding from Yugoslavia? Do you at least know that? Is that something you know about, for you to be able to assess anybody's behavior and conduct?
Is that a matter that you could deal with or not? It sounds like a matter which the court is going to have to determine.
I believe that's the case, Your Honor.
Next question.
All right, then. Following on from your report, the report which need not rely on the existing legal norms, it would appear, can we conclude from the report then that calling to arms in order to realize one's independence, which Croatia is...
These are matters of law. You are examining the witness, not arguing matters of law with her. Now, what's the next point that's relevant?
Very well. Mr. May? I am bearing in mind the fact that you have brought here a prominent representative of Human Rights Watch. And such a prominent representative would have to know the legal and international legal and internal legal context of the events that she is testifying about.
Yes. Now, what's your question, rather than comment?
Tell me this, please. Are you acquainted with, because you write in your reports and you mention the former fascist state of Croatia dating back to 1941 to 1945, which was set up by Hitler and Mussolini. I saw mention of that while I was leafing through the papers, your papers, while Mr. Nice was talking about it. Were you acquainted with the very well-known statement from Tudjman's speech at the Sabor or Assembly of the HDZ party, when he said that the independent state of Croatia was not only a Quisling creation and a fascist crime, but was also an expression of the historical aspirations of the Croatian people? I assume that that is something you know about.
I don't know the specific statement to which you refer.
Well, I am talking about and referring to the speech made in Zagreb when the first General Sabor or Assembly of the HDZ was held, that is to say Tudjman's political party, and when he was elected president of the party, and when he said that the independent state of Croatia was not only a Quisling creation and a fascist crime, but also an expression of the historical aspirations of the Croatian people. And what I'm asking you now is this: do you know that on the 4th of March, that is to say several days later, as a reaction to that speech that was delivered on the occasion, at Petrova Gora, that is to say a mountain in the Kordun area, a mass rally was held to support the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia against neo-fascism, which had been proclaimed at the Sabor or Assembly of the HDZ party. Is that something you know of? Because you were following all the events and your report was a very extensive one.
I know that there were a number of nationalist statements made by President Tudjman and his government. I know that this contributed to the feeling of beleaguerment that the Serb minority in Croatia experienced. I'm aware of that.
And do you know that after that, that is to say some 9 days after that particular rally, this was Tudjman's speech at the Sabor at the end of February, there was another rally which expressed the reaction of the population on the 4th of March, that was when it was held, and the Croatian government, the HDZ had still not won the elections, it was still the old Croatian government that was in force, sent a letter to the federal government and the governments of all the republics within the composition of Yugoslavia, in which they condemned the events, both those at the General Assembly of the HDZ party and Tudjman's speech itself, as well as the reactions of the people at the rally on Petrova Gora, and it appealed for cooperation and joint action against any further infringement of good neighborly relations, inter-ethnic relations. Do you know about that?
I don't know the details. I don't recall at this point the details, although I'm sure I probably knew a great deal about it at the time, but your recounting of these events is consistent with my impression.
All right, then now please, as in your report from the 4th to the 7th of March 2002, the statement you gave here, and you state that in August 1990, you came across a state of affairs which was deep hysteria among the population, especially the Serb population, end of quotation. And once again I quote, as well as that rhetorics and propaganda were made worse by the Serb radio, which intentionally caused panic by their biased reporting. That's what you say. Now, in respect of that statement of yours, I'm asking you, do you consider that the Croatian government, too, that is to say the government before Tudjman came into power, was also led astray by biased, prejudiced information on the part of Serb radio when it condemned Tudjman's statements that the independent state of Croatia, the emphasis he lay on that, in which about 700,000 Serbs were killed, as well as Jews and Romanis, were an expression of the historical aspirations of the Croatian people. So, did the government, the Croatian government, was it led astray by this propaganda and under the influence of Serbian propaganda put out by the radio?
I can't answer for what influenced you're talking about the Croatian government before Tudjman. I have a feeling it had its own reasons I would assume it had its own reasons for saying it, and it would not be led astray necessarily by propaganda from Serbia. When I talk about the propaganda from Serbia, I'm talking about what ordinary people were hearing, who had very little access to other information.
Mr. Leger, in your reports here, when you refer to the past and the independent state of Croatia, you say that thousands of Serbs had been killed, as well as Jews and Gypsies. That's what you say. Thousands killed, you say. Are you conscious how far you are minimizing this, speaking in thousands, when the actual state of affairs is that hundreds of thousands of people were killed? Do you differentiate between thousands and hundreds of thousands of persons killed? Several 100,000 persons killed. How is it possible that in your reports you use this kind of formulation and say thousands killed?
Well, we're talking about a period of time in history that our organization obviously did not do its own independent investigations of. In all of our writings, we tend to choose a minimum figure rather than a maximum figure because we always err on the side of caution. I have no doubt that there are probably many more than you may very well be correct in your hundreds of thousands. I don't know the figures. But I think that when in our reports we tend not to be sensational and we try to choose a lower figure rather than a higher figure.
Well, did you know that just in Jasenovac itself, a concentration camp, 700,000 persons were killed in Jasenovac alone? Did you know anything about that? Predominantly Serbs, and then there were Jews and Gypsies as well as some other Croats, communists, and so on.
I know that horrible things happened during that period. I'm not an expert to talk about them, nor is it relevant to the time frame in which that we are talking about, except to the fact that events from that period were brought up and used by the Serbian media, and I suspect officials in the Serbian government as well, to frighten and rekindle old fears and prejudices that could not lead to the peaceful relations between the nationalities within Croatia.
Very well, fine. Now, do you consider that the Serb population, after this speech with respect to the NDH, the independent state of Croatia, where hundreds of thousands of their ancestors had been killed, that after the call that coincides with this, sent to the Croatian people to take up arms in order to form an independent state of Croatia, do you consider that after all that and under those circumstances, the Serbs had no reason to panic?
I think the Serbs probably had very good reason to panic because they were being barraged from both sides. I think that there are many unfortunate statements made by the Croatian government and very much encouragement coming from Serbia for them to take up arms and defend themselves. I think I mentioned in my previous testimony that I witnessed some of the propaganda materials in Belgrade. They were very expensively and professionally prepared. This was not handouts from some little organization, but something that had a lot of money and prestige behind it. And they were horrendous to look at, and they were preying on the fears of people in the 1990s about events that had happened 50 years before.
Ms. Leber, that is all incorrect. If you take a look at and analyze the Belgrade press, you won't find anything except the facts dating back to those times, and I'm sure you won't find even a portion of any kind of warmongering rhetorics of the type that you could find at the time in the Croatian press. The two cannot even be compared. So if you would be so kind as to read about that, matters will become clear to you. Of course, if you have any interest in doing so, which quite obviously you do not. Please, on page 3.
Mr. Milosevic, comments of that sort, jibes of that sort are not a place. This is not a place for them. And move on. Yes, Ms. Labour. If you did want to say something.
I just wanted to clarify that I was not at that particular moment talking about things that appeared in the official press in Serbia. I was talking about publications, pamphlets and magazines and brochures that were put out by someone who had a great deal, they were widely circulated and they were very professionally produced, and they had only one apparent purpose, which was to terrify people of Serbian nationality living in Croatia, and also to exercise Serbs in Serbia about their compatriots in Croatia.
Dobro, gospođo Leber.
All right, then, Ms. Labour, do you
uopšte imate svest o tome
have any awareness as to how much your organization contributed to the media war and the anti-Serb propaganda that preceded the aggression against Yugoslavia?
I would take strong exception to that statement. I do not think that we contributed to anti-Serb propaganda. Certainly at that juncture we were bending over backwards to be fair to all sides. And one of my instructions to my staff was that there should be equal coverage of abuses by Serbs and abuses by the Croats. And as you see in the letter that we presented to you and General Adic, that there was an accompanied letter, or a comparable letter that was delivered to President Tudjman. It's equal in length. Very many of exactly the same types of abuses were documented. I think we were being extremely fair and extremely impartial in our coverage of that war, and I take exception at the fact that you would suggest that we were contributing to anti-Serb propaganda.
Well,
that could be taken as a sort of symmetry had it been presented in the right proportions. But I suppose you assume that it was not the Serbs in Croatia that attacked the Croats, but that they were exposed to attacks by the new Croatian government and authorities. Is that something you're aware of?
I don't think it was that simple.
Well, in your reports, you use the expression according to which the Serbs occupied part of Croatian territory, or rather you say part of Croatian territory which was occupied by the Serbs. You use that term in several places in your report. It is a term that you use frequently, and this implies that that is so, that is correct.
Please continue. I don't know what the question is.
Well, you talk about the fact that the Serbs occupied a portion of Croatian territory. You say on part of Croatian territory occupied by the Serbs. You use this phrase in a number of contexts within your report.
What period of time are we talking about now? Are we talking about before the war or during the war?
We're talking about the time of the conflict in Croatia.
There were areas of Croatia that were predominantly Serb. That's in population. I don't understand what your question is.
Well, can we speak about the Serbs occupying a part of Croatian territory at all? That is my question to you. Is that how we can put it?
Do you mean, when you say occupy, do you mean living in? Or do you mean taking control of militarily? I'm not quite sure what your question is.
Whichever way you like to interpret it, can we say at all that Serbs occupied parts of Croatian territory? Can we use the verb occupation of Croatian territory? That's what I'm asking you, because you're using that expression.
Well, I would have to look at it in context. I think that in the course of the conflict, Serb groups, insurgents, took up arms and occupied certain parts of Croatian territory, and the Yugoslav army also moved in to protect the situation, and in effect, according to our reports, solidified the Serb occupation of certain parts of Croatia.
Dobro. Dakle, okupirali
Very well,
deo.
so
Evo,
you say
samo mi recite,
occupied
da li greši
certain
vaš
parts. Now,
sunarodnik
tell me if your compatriot is wrong when he says
General
the following.
Charles Boyd.
General Charles Boyd,
bivši zamjenik
the former
komandanta
deputy commander
Evropske
of
komande
the European Command,
Snaga
European
Sjedinjenih
staff
država.
of the United
On
States
piše
Forces,
u
and this is
Foreign
what he
Affairs,
writes in the
September,
Foreign
October
Affairs Journal,
95.
September,
godine.
October 1995.
The popular image of this war is one of unrelenting Serb expansion. Much of what the Croatians call the occupied territories is land that has been held by Serbs for more than 3 centuries. The same is true of most of Serb land in Bosnia, what the Western media frequently refer to as the 70% of Bosnia seized by rebel Serbs. In short, the Serbs were not trying to conquer new territory, but merely to hold onto what was already theirs. Jel on nije u pravu?
Isn't he right?
Who are you quoting now? I didn't get the... Who wrote these words?
To je Charles Boyd.
It is Charles Boyd,
General Charles
Boyd,
former deputy
former deputy commander of the U.S. European Command.
A to je napisao, možete da
And
nađete
he wrote this. You can
u
find
časopisu
the article
Foreign
in the
Affairs
Foreign Affairs
za
Journal,
September-Oktober 95.
September,
godine.
October
To je
1995.
citat
It is a quotation
onoga što je on napisao.
from what he wrote.
Well, if you're
Koliko je to, koliko...
Let the
So
witness,
how far is
let
that?
the witness answer.
Well, if you're asking me whether Serbs lived in these various areas, I assume that is correct. If you're asking me whether they had a right to, whether the Serbian Republic had a right to take over those areas which fell within the borders of another republic, I have to go back to my previous answer. This is not within my competence to discuss. This has to do with national borders, with self-determination, with issues that I think are, I can't say whether it's appropriate or inappropriate for this body to discuss, but it's inappropriate for me to discuss.
A dobro, da li vi to onda tvrdite
All
da
right, are you then
pravo na
claiming that the right to
samoopredeljenje je pripadalo samo
self-determination
hrvatskom narodu,
was a right
a nije
enjoyed only
pripadalo
by the
srpskom
Croatian
narodu?
people and not by the Serb people as well?
The witness has just said, don't bother to answer. The witness has just said it's not within her competence to answer. So there's no point arguing the same thing over and over again. Let's move on, if there is anything else you've got to ask.
To se, gospodine May, zove
That, Mr. May, is
in
called
adjecto.
contradictio in adjecto,
Koliko da konstatujemo, možemo da idemo
just
dalje.
to make a point of that, and then we can
Kažete-
move on.
Just
Na
one
strani
matter
3.
before we go on. Ms. Labour, just for curiosity, in the first tab 1 of this exhibit, is in page 11, and it's footnote 20. You said that you are not an expert in secession matter and in some, whether it's okay or not, but I note that you wrote an article named "Why Keep Yugoslavia One Country."
Yes.
What did you write on that article?
I would like to explain that to you. I'm glad that you asked that question. I wrote an article. I did not write the headline of the article, which was written. The article appeared in the New York Times, which has a policy of writing its own headlines. And the headline writer misread the context of the article, so that if you just see that title, it would imply that, in fact, we did take a position on whether or not the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia should remain or not. In the article, we advocated that the U.S. government should use economic sanctions against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and also, if possible, against Serbia, because we felt that they were, at the time, involved in severe human rights abuses, specifically in Kosovo. And we recognized the fact that the federal government was powerless at that point to really do very much, even if it wanted to, and that Serbia, the Serbian government, was calling all the shots. So our recommendation was that U.S. aid be targeted and denied to parts of the Federation that were abusing human rights. We never said that Yugoslavia should not remain one country, and as a matter of fact, when the article appeared, I was appalled at the headline, as were my colleagues at Human Rights Watch, and we were upset and felt it misled people until they read the article. But thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, too.
I am very happy, too, to be able to hear here that you were a protagonist of that process of imposing sanctions against Yugoslavia, the sanctions that were the worst possible ones, most brutal, since the term came into existence, and which were a real silent sort of genocide. So how come you, from a human rights organization, advocated the imposition of sanctions on Yugoslavia?
As an organization, we very often use that as a means, short of other means, to get a country to observe human rights principles. It's something that we advocate in many different situations. We always try to make an exception for humanitarian aid. We talk about economic sanctions. We do not advocate sanctions that will impose hardships on people, on the populace of the country, but on the governments. It's one of the various forms we have of trying to put pressure on offending governments.
Well, I'm sure you know that the sanctions were introduced in 1992, and a moment ago you said here, in response to a question put to you by Mr. Kwon, that the reason was Kosovo. And the explanation was that sanctions were being introduced because we were assisting Serbs in Bosnia and the Serbs in Croatia, too, which was not in dispute. That we assisted them is not in dispute. So tell me now, please, Ms. Leber, the situation facing Serbs in Bosnia and in Croatia, would it be logical, and I'm sure you know and are aware of the fact that Germany and the Vatican, for example, and many other countries, and ultimately your own country too, assisted Croatia, and the Muslims too, and that Saudi Arabia, including the Mujahideen, and other countries too, sent tens of thousands of extremists to help the Muslims. And is it therefore legal and logical that foreign countries, some of them with tens of thousands of kilometers away, should help the Croats and Muslims, whereas it was illogical for the Serbs to help the Serbs themselves? And then this is a crime which ought to be sanctioned, punished by sanctions. Is that a function of...
We must come to a question. If you look at the live note, the transcript as it's scrolling up, I don't know whether you feel you can comment on what the accused is saying or not. I mean, he's trying to make a point about countries coming to the aid of the Croats. So what he's saying, I think, is why shouldn't he come to the aid of the Serbs? I think that's the point.
Gone a bit afield. At the time that we were advocating sanctions in this article, it was in 1990, and it was before the Bosnian War. Our government did not impose sanctions at that time. Our government was committed, I think, at that point to keep Yugoslavia one country and working with the federal government. What you're talking about is something that happened several years later when the war in Bosnia began, and so I think the two issues are confused.
go on for another 5 minutes, and then we'll adjourn.
Na strani 3
On page
u
3,
prvom pasusu
in the
vašeg
first
iskaza
paragraph of
4.
your
do 7. mart
statement,
2002.
from the
kažete
4th to the 7th of March
da je 90. godine,
2002,
citiram,
you say that in
the
1990,
early uprising of
and
the
I
republics
quote,
of Slovenia and then
the
Croatia
uprising of the
started a chain
republics of Slovenia and then
events
Croatia started a
that led
chain
to
of
the war in
events that
Balkans.
led
Jel'
to the
tako?
war in the Balkans. Is that right?
I'm sorry, page 3 of what document?
To je strana 3,
Page
pasus 1
3.
vašeg iskaza.
First paragraph
Is this
of your
The witness
statement.
statement, yes.
Yes, what was the question?
Pa, pošto ste to rekli,
Having
da li
said that,
smatrate da je
Do
secesija
you consider
za koju
that
su
the
se opredelile
secession
Hrvatska i
that Croatia and
Slovenija
Slovenia
bila protivna
opted for
međunarodnom
was
pravu i
contrary
ustavnom
to
poretku
international
Jugoslavije?
law and the constitutional order of Yugoslavia?
Not a question for the witness. Next question.
A da li se mogu ljudska prava
Can human rights
tretirati
be
izvan
treated
konteksta
out
prava
of the
uopšte i
context of
međunarodnog
law in
pravnog
general
poretka
and the international
i pravnog
legal
poretka
order
neke države?
and the legal order of a
Ne
particular
znam šta je
country?
vaš
I
stav
don't
kao
know what is your
organizacije
position
Human Rights
as an
Watch.
organization, that is the position of the Human Rights Watch.
Our position is to protect the human rights that you will find in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Those are the rights that we protect. We are an independent, non-governmental organization. We carefully choose the area that we cover, that we are able to cover. We can't be all over the spectrum. We have our own mandate and we stay within it. And the question of self-determination is not one of the rights that we take up as an organization. Other people do, but it's pointless to keep asking me about it because I can't speak on behalf of my organization and I can't even speak on behalf of myself. It's not an issue that I feel comfortable discussing.
Kako se, recite mi, ljudska prava,
Tell me,
ta o
please,
kojima vi govorite,
those human rights
mogu
that you are
zaštititi
referring to, how
izazivanjem
can they be
ratova,
protected by
izazivanjem
provoking
građanskog rata,
wars, by
nasilnim
provoking
raspadom
civil
jedne zemlje
wars,
koja
by
je
violent
uspešno se razvijala?
disintegration of a
Kako se
country
to
that
mogu na
was
taj način
developing
zaštititi
successfully?
uvođenjem
How can
sankcija,
human rights be protected
vojnom
in that way?
intervencijom,
By
na
introducing
kraju agresijom
sanctions,
i
military
bombardovanjem?
intervention, finally
Je to
by
sve u
aggression
skladu
and
sa zaštitom
bombing?
ljudskih prava
Is all that
za
in
koje se
accordance
zalaže
with the
Human Rights
protection of
Watch?
human rights that the Human Rights Watch advocates?
I'd like to ask you that question, Mr. Milosevic.
On that,
Many years.
A ne čini li
on that question,
Don't you think?
on that note, we'll end. It's 10 to. Ms. Labour, would you be back, please, at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to conclude your evidence?
I will.
koliko ste mi odredili vremena za sutra,
How much
gospodine May?
time are
Samo
you
da znam
allowing me
precizno.
for tomorrow, Mr. May?
50 minutes.
All right. Veuillez vous lever.